President of Ukraine, Supreme Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky.
Президент України, Верховний Головнокомандувач Збройних сил України Володимир Зеленський.
Glory to Ukraine. Glory to the heroes. Dear Ukrainian people, today is the 500th day of the full-scale war. 500 days as we fight for freedom and independence for Ukraine, for dignity, for the right to life for all our people in the whole country. Ukraine will always be grateful to everyone who fights for it, our warriors, our heroes. Today, on the 500th day of the war, we have returned to Ukraine 5 of our heroes. Heroes of Ukraine. The commanders of the defense of Mariupol and Azovstal. Denis Prokopenko, Sviatoslav Palomar, Sergei Volinsky, Oleg Komenko, Denis Shligo. They fought for the sake of Ukraine. They fought heroically, absolutely. They came through the Russian captivity. Then, more than 300 days, they were in Turkey. It's time for them to be at home. And I want to thank our team that works for the return of Ukrainians home. Andrei Yermak, Kirill Budinov, Igor Klimenko, Rustem Umer, the Security Service of Ukraine. Thank you, guys, Vasily Vasilyevich. And I want to thank the Turkish side, especially President Erdogan, for helping to free our people. 500 days. 500 days ago, many people in the world did not understand what we are, what you are, what to expect from us, and what our heroes are. But now everyone understands. Now the world believes in Ukraine. The world is inspired by our courage. The world is inspired by our heroes. And most importantly, Ukrainians believe in Ukraine. Ukrainians see what we are capable of when we are together. We are the strongest in unity. In 500 days of such a war for freedom, thousands and thousands of our people showed maximum courage. Almost 50,000 Ukrainian soldiers were awarded state awards. 298 Ukrainians and Ukrainians received the highest title of Hero of Ukraine. 298. And we all have to honor and remember these people, our heroes. And now, and after our victory, and our children, and our grandchildren, and all generations of the Ukrainian people, we thank you, heroes of Ukraine. Glory to Ukraine. Glory to heroes. Our heroes are Senior Lieutenant Kirill Agasiev, Major Oleg Adamovsky, Junior Sergeant Sviatoslav Alexopolsky, Colonel Vladislav Alurov, Senior Soldier Artem Amelin, Colonel Yuri Andrienko, Colonel Dmitro Apukin, Junior Sergeant Ilya Akhmetyuryev, Sergeant Vladimir Belyev,
Полковник Дмитро Апухтін, молодший сержант Ілля Ахмедгарєєв.
Senior Lieutenant Vladislav Bandar, Colonel Sergei Baranovsky, Colonel Vladimir Baranyuk, Senior Lieutenant Sergei Barsukov, Captain Vladimir Barchuk, Major Dmitro Bashkinsov,
Старший лейтенант Сергій
Colonel Igor Bedjage, Senior Lieutenant Maxim Belakin, Master Sergeant Pavel Belauz, Lieutenant Colonel Vadim Blagovistny, Junior Lieutenant Vadim Blychek, Junior Lieutenant Yuri Blod, Junior Lieutenant Taras Bobanek, Major Yevgeny Bovik,
підполковник Вадим Благовісний, молодший лейтенант Вадим Блищик, молодший лейтенант Юрій Блоха, молодший лейтенант Тарас Бобанич, майор Євгеній Бова.
Captain Vasil Boychko, Senior Soldier Sergei Bashko, Senior Lieutenant Vitaly Bondarik, Major Vitaly Bawanik, Major Alexander Brinulov, Master Sergeant Dmitro Bublik,
майор
Master Sergeant Vladislav Bavalkin, Lieutenant Colonel Sergei Burkovsky, Soldier Leonid Butysin, Soldier Roman Butysin, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Bogorovsky,
солдат Леонід Бутусін, солдат Роман Бутусін,
Lieutenant Colonel Dmitro Vasilyev, Senior Sergeant Sergei Vasik, Lieutenant Colonel Sergei Verbitsky, Captain Ilya Vergin, Major Kirill Virs, Major Andrei Verkhogliat,
капітан Ілля Вергун, майор Кирило Верес,
Lieutenant Colonel Vladimir Vesnin, Major Sergei Volinsky, Junior Sergeant Yevgeny Volkov, Major Vadim Voroshilov, Soldier Alexander Harbas,
Євгеній Волков, майор
Lieutenant Colonel Roman Gak, Major Ivan Vozdov, Lieutenant Colonel Oleg Hegetkory, Senior Lieutenant Andrei Heroes, Captain Valery Gulbov, Soldier Roman Glomba,
Гегечкорі, старший лейтенант Андрій Герос, капітан Валерій Глебов, солдат Роман
Lieutenant Colonel Oleg Goliny, Lieutenant Colonel Ivan Gleshevsky, Senior Lieutenant Viktor Golovko, Colonel Oleg Goncharek, Captain Vladislav Gorbany, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Grigoriev, Senior Lieutenant Vitaly Gritsenko, Staff Sergeant Roman Grisha, Lieutenant Yevgeny Romitsky, Lieutenant Colonel Oleg Grudzevich, Colonel Valery Guts, Captain Vitaly Gurel,
підполковник Олег Грудзевич, полковник Валерій Гуць,
Senior Lieutenant Vladimir Gutzel, Major Roman Dharma Gray, Lieutenant Colonel Igor Dashko, Junior Sergeant Vitaly Derek, Sergeant Indra Rusova, Lieutenant Colonel Denis Dike, Junior Lieutenant Igor Dikin, Soldier Taras Dobbin, Senior Lieutenant Dmitro Dozierny, Captain Roman Drogoretsky, Major Bogdan Drinov, Major Sergei Dudin, Senior Sergeant Vladimir Dudchenko,
Дрогомрецький, майор Богдан Дронов, майор Сергій Дудін,
Lieutenant Colonel Vyacheslav Yurkov, Senior Sergeant Sergei Therzevsky, Lieutenant Colonel Mukimboy Zumabov, Lieutenant Colonel Dmitro Zavadsky, Major Vadim Zeleniak,
Жумабоєв, підполковник
Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Zurovy, Senior Sergeant Andrei Ivashko, Lieutenant Colonel Viktor Ivchik, Senior Lieutenant Maxim Kagel, Captain Bogdan Kaligorsky, Captain Edward Kamerdzin,
Віктор Івчук, старший лейтенант Максим Кагал, капітан Богдан Калагурський, капітан
Senior Lieutenant Yuri Kanyuk, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Kapichin, Major Bogdan Karvatko, Colonel Roman Kacher, Colonel Dmitro Kashenko, Senior Soldier Valentin Klimchik,
Роман
Junior Lieutenant Alexander Kluchko, Lieutenant Alexander Kovalenko, Soldier Yuri Kovalchuk, Lieutenant Colonel Rostislav Kozy, Sergeant Igor Kolesnikenko, Major Dmitro Kolomiets,
Юрій Коваль,
Lieutenant Bogdan Korninchik, Major Alexander Korninchik, Captain Sergei Korol, Captain Alexander Korpin, Colonel Sergei Kotenko, Senior Sergeant Andrei Koshovts, Senior Lieutenant Artur Kravchenko,
Сергій Король, капітан Олександр Корпан, полковник Сергій Котенко, старший сержант Андрій Кошовець, старший лейтенант Артур Кравченко,
Brigade General Dmitro Krasilnikov, Lieutenant Colonel Andrei Kroglov, Major Alexander Kukurbit, Colonel Rayan Kulagin,
майор Олександр
Staff Sergeant Sergei Kulik, Colonel Mikhail Korechchenko, Colonel Evgeny Kurish, Colonel Vitaly Kukuryevit, Staff Sergeant Dmitro Kushner, Sergeant Denis Lubinsky, Senior Soldier Alexander Lubinsky,
Кучерявий, штаб-сержант Дмитро Кушнір, сержант
Lieutenant Colonel Oleg Lakistin, Junior Sergeant Igor Levchenko, Senior Sergeant Alexander Lunov, Lieutenant Colonel Bogdan Leshinin, Captain Ivan Leshenkov, Major Evgen Lysenko,
Леунов, підполковник Богдан Лещинин, капітан Іван Лещенков, майор
Junior Sergeant Vadim Lesyankov, Lieutenant Vitaly Litvin, Lieutenant Colonel Andrei Litkin, Soldier Alexander Lukinovich, Colonel Alexander Lutsenko,
солдат
Captain Michael Lyuberets, Major Andrei Lutashin, Captain Alexander Lyashenko, Colonel Alexei Maestrenko, Lieutenant Michael Makarevich, Master Sergeant Alexander Makarenko,
Ляшенко, полковник Олексій Майстренко, лейтенант Микола Макаревич, майстер-сержант
Captain Denis Makarovsky, Senior Lieutenant Denis Maxishko, Colonel Roman Mamako, Captain Vadim Manko, Chief Sergeant Kirill Marek, Colonel Alexander Mariniak, Soldier Roman Marcinyak, Lieutenant Colonel Gennady Matulyak, Colonel Alexander Magachev, Soldier Alexander Matsayevsky, Major Yaroslav Melnik, Junior Sergeant Alexei Mershovy,
солдат Олександр Матієвський, майор Ярослав Мельник, молодший сержант
Captain Yuri Mikhailyak, Major Igor Mikhailchuk, Junior Sergeant Sergei Mishchenko, Lieutenant Vitaly Mufchin, Senior Sergeant Oleg Moroz, Colonel Alexander Mostovi, Soldier Konstantin Rachko, Major Daniloma Rashko, Colonel Sergei Musiko, Lieutenant General Sergei Nov, Major Yuri Nazarek, Junior Sergeant Mikhail Nizolini, General Major Viktor Nikolyak,
майор Юрій
Second Rank Captain Nikonov, Soldier Andriy Nikonchik, Captain Andriy Norov, Senior Sergeant Mykola Nosenko, Colonel Alexander Oksanchenko, Lieutenant General Mykola Olesha, Captain Oleg Oliv, Soldier Yaroslav Olinik, Junior Sergeant Vitaly Anobrienko, Sergeant Andriy Orlov, Lieutenant Colonel Oleksiy Osipenko, Captain Viktor Oterklevich, Lieutenant Colonel Valery Oshkolov,
сержант Андрій Орлов, підполковник Олексій
Lieutenant General Alexander Pavlyuk, Colonel Valery Padatel, Major Sviatoslav Palomar, Colonel Mykola Palaz, Lieutenant Yevgeny Palchenko, Lieutenant Stanislav Partalov, Captain Sergei Parkamenko,
полковник Микола Палас, лейтенант Євгеній Пальченко, лейтенант Станіслав Партала, капітан Сергій
Senior Soldier Vitaly Parkamik, Captain Oleg Pasiknik, Lieutenant Lev Pashko, Colonel Alexander Pivnenko, Lieutenant Colonel Sergei Poberezits, Lieutenant Colonel Vyacheslav Panomarenko, Captain Sergei Panomarenko, First Rank Captain Ruslan Popov, Lieutenant Colonel Vladimir Poteshkin, Senior Sergeant Vladimir Primachenko, Major Radislav Prokopenko, Major Denis Prokopenko, Senior Lieutenant Vyacheslav Rayanov, Sergeant Mikhail Ryutsky, Sergeant Denis Richter, Junior Sergeant Alexander Romanov, Captain Dmitro Romanchenko, Senior Lieutenant Roman Rusnik, Lieutenant Colonel Vitaly Savich, Lieutenant Denis Samofil, Sailor Valery Samofilov, Lieutenant Vitaly Sapilov, Lieutenant Daniel Safinov, Major Pavlo Azbaitov, Soldier Oleg Svinchuk, Senior Sergeant Alexei Sinyuk, Captain Igor Serdyuk, Senior Lieutenant Vladimir Sudanik,
солдат Олег Свинчук,
General Colonel Alexander Sursky, Senior Sergeant Olga Simonova, Colonel Sergei Surchenko, Sailor Vitaly Skakin, Senior Lieutenant Vladislav Skvortsov, Colonel Igor Skibyuk, Senior Sergeant Alexei Skamliev, Colonel Alexander Solzarenko, Senior Lieutenant Artem Solzerchuk, Major Roman Sobkiv, Senior Soldier Sergei Sova, Sergeant Vladimir Sovolisovets, General Lieutenant Yuri Sodol, Major Ivan Solovyov, Senior Lieutenant Andrei Soroka,
старший солдат Сергій Сова, сержант Володимир Сова-Лісовець, генерал
Lieutenant Colonel Sergei Starchenko, Senior Lieutenant Volodymyr Stelmak, Major Georgy Strelkov, Lieutenant Yulian Stupak, Sergeant Katerina Stupnitska, Colonel Vadim Sukharevsky, Senior Lieutenant Sergei Suchkov, Major Stepan Tarabalk, Lieutenant Georgy Tarasenko, Junior Sergeant Alexander Timchenko, Senior Lieutenant Dmitro Todorov, Lieutenant Vladislava Kranes, Senior Lieutenant Pavlo Isov, Colonel Pavlov Fedotsenko, Senior Sergeant Dmitro Fineshin,
лейтенант Владислав Українець, старший лейтенант Павло
Senior Lieutenant Andrei Hanin, Senior Lieutenant Sergei Kharchenko, Senior Sergeant Boris Kharchuk, Captain Alexei Kiznyuk, Colonel Leonid Kode, Major Vyacheslav Kodakivsky, Senior Lieutenant Andrei Komenko, Major Oleg Komenko, Colonel Edward Krushin, Sergeant Ivan Krapko, Major Andrei Tsarenko, Lieutenant Colonel Yakoslav Saigankov, Master Sergeant Alexander Tsupak, Soldier Mykolov Sarek, Senior Sergeant Mikhail Chibanenko, Senior Lieutenant Dmitro Chavalov,
солдат Микола
Colonel Denis Chayak, Major Roman Chukin, Lieutenant Mykola Chobanu, Major Stepan Chobanu, Senior Lieutenant Vladimir Chorny, Major Oleg Chornomernits, Junior Lieutenant Alexander Chub, Colonel Mykola Chumuk, Senior Lieutenant Mikhail Chuprin, Major Ivan Shamatolov, Lieutenant Colonel Artem Sharkov, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Shemit, Captain Viktor Shemilov, Colonel Denis Shliga, Captain Andrei Shogun, Lieutenant Colonel Dmitro Shuvakov, Junior Sergeant Ivan Shkogolov, Major Alexander Yurkovsky, Colonel Yuri Yurchik, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Yakovenko, Lieutenant Colonel Sergei Yandalsky, Senior Sergeant Mykola Yanishin, Colonel Sergei Yermenko, Captain Vadim Yashchenko.
Підполковник Сергій Яндульський, головний сержант Микола Янишин, полковник Сергій Яременко, капітан Вадим Ященко.
We cannot talk openly about some of our heroes yet. Their courage was so special that we will be able to talk about them and their real achievements only after our victory.
Їх реальні потужні здобутки цих героїв України ми зможемо розказати лише після нашої перемоги.
And we will definitely talk about the names of all our heroes, whose names I have just named a significant part of the name of the hero of Ukraine posthumously.
Назвав значній частині звання Герой України присвоєння.
Now, I would like to ask you to remain silent for a moment in memory of all our people who gave their lives for our freedom, for an independent Ukraine.
За нашу свободу, за незалежну Україну.
Thank you very much. It is very, very important.
Дуже дякую. Це дуже важливо.
It is very important to remember all of them. Among us now is the hero of Ukraine, Colonel Alexander Pivnenko, a powerful soldier of the National Guard of Ukraine, a combat officer. He was appointed in the battles against Russian invaders, in particular in the battles for Bakhmut. I have appointed the hero of Ukraine, Alexander Pivnenko, as the commander of the National Guard of Ukraine.
Командувачем Національної гвардії України.
Mr. Commander, I wish you all our Ukraine, the liberation of all our land, the return of all our people to the dream victory. And of course, I am grateful to all of you, grateful to all our warriors who today are awarded state awards for courage, for the feats that we defend life and our beautiful country.
За подвиги, якими бороните життя і нашу прекрасну державу.
Thank you. Glory to all Ukrainians and Ukrainians of different times who gained freedom, gained strength for Ukraine. Glory to all our heroes. Glory to the people of Ukraine.
Народу України.
We will win. Glory to Ukraine. Glory to the heroes. I serve the Ukrainian people. I serve the Ukrainian people.
Служу українському народу! Служу українському народу. Служу українському народу! Служу українському народу. Дякую. Служу українському народу. Служу українському народу. Служу українському народу. Дякую. Служу українському народу. Дякую. Служу українському народу. Дякую.
President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. Thank you very much.
Вітаю. Дякую.
God bless you. Welcome to your home. Thank you.
Вам краще за все. Дякую вам. Дякую.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Дякую.
Just lie here.